Thank you for joining us for this NGO Monitor special webinar on the importance of military expertise in assessing laws of war compliance. I also want to welcome my colleague Ann Hertzberg, NGO Monitor's legal advisor and UN representative. She's a graduate of Oberlin College and Columbia University Law School. I guess you still want to keep that on your CV. Prior to joining NGO Monitor about 18 years ago, she worked as an attorney in New York. Her research focuses on business and human rights, the laws of armed conflict, and NGOs in the UN, and a lot of other related issues. She's the author of the groundbreaking NGO lawfare, Exploitation of Courts in the Arab-Israeli Conflict, something that she was one of the first to point out, and now we're dealing with it on a daily basis. And she co-authored with me Best Practices for Human Rights and Humanitarian Fact-Finding, along with many other publications. Joining us today are two renowned experts. They probably don't need any introduction, so I'll make it short. Col Richard Kemp served in the British Army for 29 years, including in the first Gulf War in 1991, Bosnia, Northern Ireland, 8 tours of duty as commander, and then as commander of British forces in Afghanistan in 2003. And during his final period of military duty, he was head of the International Terrorism and Iraq team for the Joint Intelligence Committee, and subsequently chairman of the COBRA intelligence group in the UK. He was made a commander of the Order of the British Empire for his work on the July 2005 London bombings. Colonel Kemp is a long-standing member of NGO Monitor's International Advisory Board, a member of the high-level military group which addresses the implications of fighting enemies who disregard the law of armed conflict while exploiting adherence to Western nations. Since October 7th, he's been a central voice in countering the anti-Israel lawfare campaigns. Also joining us, Major Andrew Fox, who served in the British Army from 2005 to 2021, including 3 tours in Afghanistan, including one with the U.S. Army Special Forces, and additional tours in Bosnia, the Middle East, and Northern Ireland. After his active service, Andrew became a senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. He holds degrees in law and politics, modern war studies, and psychology. In recent months, after October 7th, Major Fox has established a worldwide reputation as an expert on the realities and myths of modern asymmetric counter-terror war, particularly from Hamas and Gaza, and these issues are the focus of our discussion. We are honored to welcome all of you to this NGO Monitor webinar. Our focus today is on the political influence of those who claim to speak under the banner of international law, or law of armed conflict, particularly the network of influential NGO leaders, UN officials, and journalists who echo their pronouncements, as well as the international courts and their university allies, almost none of whom have any real-world military experience. I have to say that as a graduate student in international politics 50 years ago, we covered these issues in 1 week. International law was considered to be an idealistic endeavor of no practical significance. We read E.H. Carr's book, The 20 Years Crisis, which documents the folly of the British anti-war movement between the 2 world wars. But by the beginning of this century, these lessons were forgotten. I saw this in the NGO campaigns revolving around the IDF's 2002 defensive shield counter-terror operation in Jenin. That was 22 years ago. And yet the documents, the claims, the statements are almost the same. The only difference is they didn't have social media then. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and others successfully pushed the myths of a massacre, of war crimes, and collective punishment. In 2009, when the International Criminal Court was up and running, the NGOs worked closely with the UN Human Rights Council in pushing the ICC investigations against Israel, even back then, and as reflected in the notorious and later rescinded Goalstone Report, and revolving around accusations of disproportionality. Every IHL weapon was used before, and since October 7th, the so-called human rights community has exploded with these deadly allegations. To open our discussion, my colleague Ann Hertzberg will pose questions to both Major Fox and Colonel Kemp.
Thanks so much, Gerald. We're honored to have Colonel Kemp and Major Fox here. I've had the pleasure to know Colonel Kemp for almost 15 years now, and had the pleasure to meet Major Fox in Tel Aviv for the first time back in April, where we had a very nice discussion about some of the issues we want to get into tonight. So, building off Gerald's remarks, the public discourse about and the framing of the conflict reflects a clear lack of understanding regarding military operations. There is an unrealistic expectation of perfection and an assumption that anything not approaching perfection is evidence of malice or wrongdoing. NGOs have been driving this narrative and pushing claims of criminality. They are pushing a version of international law that is becoming ever more divorced from the laws of armed conflict and military operations. Unfortunately, international institutions like the ICC or export license control processes are influenced by these damaging narratives and are vulnerable to being exploited by bad actors. And this exploitation is further enabled by this substantive lack of military expertise. It's inconceivable that you would make pronouncements on a medical malpractice case without consulting a medical expert, or investigate a building failure without seeking out an engineer. Yet many international institutions, when accusing Israel of war crimes or now genocide or other violations of the laws of war, do not seek out military experts. The ICC prosecutor, for instance, convened a panel of experts which underpinned the arrest warrant request for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, but this panel included no military nor humanitarian aid expert. So with that being said, I want to first turn to the work of the high-level military group, which was founded by Colonel Kemp, and of which Major Fox is a part, and was hoping you could both speak about this initiative, your July visit to Israel and Gaza, and the amicus brief that you filed with the ICC at the end of July.
Well, I think with my inclusion as a major, it became the medium level military group. I kind of aspire quite to Richard's heights of military excellence. But it was a really fascinating trip, and we were given access at pretty much every level you could possibly dream of, from the political level through to strategic planners in IDF headquarters in Nigeria in Tel Aviv, through to Southern Command and their commander, who talked us through the operational design of what's going on in Gaza. And then we actually managed to get out into Gaza itself along the Philadelphia corridor, where we were escorted by one of the brigades who were conducting operations there. And we were able to see firsthand not only the aftermath of some of the operations that have taken place in Gaza, but also we've seen them in action and how they're conducting themselves on the ground there. So it gave us a holistic overview of everything from the political level all the way down to the tactical level. And I think most importantly for us, and where this becomes really useful, is the time we spent with the IDF's legal department, the military advocate general, where we were given a comprehensive overview of not only the disciplinary action they'll take against soldiers who do contravene military law and are held accountable for that, which is really, really important. But also we had a look at rules of engagement, and we had a look at how the IDF investigates allegations. And so that gave us, as with the context of our own militaries and our own experience, it gave us the assurance that the IDF is doing things as we would expect a top-tier moral army to do.
Richard?
Yeah, thanks very much, Anne. Thank you for both you and Gerald for inviting me to join you. And you make me feel very old when you say that we've known each other for 15 years. But nevertheless, I'll just make a comment about, before I speak a bit briefly about the high-level military group, which Andrew's covered, I think, very extensively. And although Andrew is a mere major, or was a mere major, and I'm a very, very exalted colonel, I think he would probably agree or insist on the fact that, of course, he was a member of the parachute regiment, the elite parachute regiment, and I was a very humble basic infantryman in the Royal Anglian Regiment. So I think, certainly on his terms, I suspect a major in the parachute regiment probably outranks a colonel in any other regiment. But he agrees with me. But just a word on the general concept of people of organizations not taking military expertise into account, not taking it seriously, not bothering to get hold of it. I can recall on one of the previous, I forget exactly which one it was, but one of the previous UN Human Rights Council investigations into another conflict in Gaza, I gave evidence. I spoke at the emergency session in which they debated it. Before that, I gave evidence to the commission that was investigating it in Geneva. And the chairman of the commission said to me, and I don't think she really knew what my opinion was when she said this, but she said, looking at your credentials here, I only wish that we could have someone who knows about military stuff on our panel, because we've got nobody at all that knows anything about military issues, which I knew that anyway, but it's quite extraordinary that the chairman of a commission like that, with pretty much limitless funds, can't find somewhere a military expert to make a contribution. I suspect any military expert that was willing to give a frank and honest opinion of what was happening probably wouldn't be welcome in Geneva anyway, because their agenda is not, I don't think, to find the truth. It's to achieve their political objectives, which of course are predominantly anti-Israel. The other comment just to make as well is on, you mentioned the since discredited Goalstone Report, in which Judge Goalstone eventually retracted his allegations or his findings of crimes against humanity and war crimes against Israel. He had a military advisor on his panel, and his military advisor was an Irish army colonel who had, and we shouldn't forget that the Irish army has never fought in a battle of any sort. They've done a lot of peacekeeping and monitoring and things like that, but they've never fought in any war. And much of the Goalstone Report was focused on Operation Cast Lead, which was predominantly an air operation. And the Irish don't have an air force. I think they've got a couple of helicopters that are used for transporting generals around the place. So what kind of a military expert was that? You might as well have got a waiter in a hotel or anyone off the street to talk about it. As I'm not disparaging the Irish army, but the reality is they simply don't have the experience that you need to be able to talk intelligently about this subject. The high-level military group, I think Andrew covered it pretty well. We did we spent a week here. As he said, we had a lot of access to a lot of senior people and junior people as well, and we're able to get a good feel for the way the ADF operates, and including a visit inside Gaza. We drove the length of the Philadelphia corridor, visited Rafah, saw with our own eyes the way things were happening there. And these generals that were part of the group, mostly generals, some other people as well, who they're all experts. They all follow what's going on. But I think actually getting on the ground, and I don't just mean inside Gaza, but getting into Israel and talking to people who are actually conducting the war, certainly was a big influence on them, and they were able to apply their years and years of expertise to the reality of what's going on in Israel. So it was invaluable. And as you mentioned, Anne, we put in an amicus brief to the International Criminal Court, which essentially gave, we didn't really talk much about, we did speak a bit about complementarity from our review of the Israeli justice system, particularly the IDF justice system. But we focused mainly on the reality that the two main charges against Netanyahu and Gallant are, one, that they've carried out war crimes by unlawful killing of a large number of civilians in Gaza, and also attempted to use starvation as a weapon of war. And I think we were able to show clearly in our amicus brief that it couldn't have happened, because in order for a prime minister and a defense minister to be guilty of those offences, somebody's actually got to carry out. They're not going to get a machine gun themselves and go and gun people down in Gaza or steal humanitarian aid. It's got to be done by someone, and that someone's the IDF. And we, through our examination, were very, very clear that the IDF received no such orders, in fact, quite the opposite. And there's no evidence whatsoever that from our close examination, that the IDF was indulging in this. So really, we pointed out that it simply couldn't be true on the basis of what we've seen and what we've researched.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go into a very much part of this process, the term that we've heard at least since Goalstone and probably before, probably Janine in 2002, and that is this issue of proportionality. It's one of the accusations that's constantly made before genocide and before starvation. They use disproportionality. And I want to ask both of you, with your military experience, whether in a type of war where you've got what was once called asymmetric warfare, I think that term is a mild term compared to what we see in Gaza, where you've got, the latest I saw was 500 miles, an estimate of 500 miles of underground infrastructure, concrete line, very deep under the ground, where this whole operation, the entire attack that Hamas has started, again, going back many years, but certainly on October 7th and continuing. How do you fight against that and be able to measure something called proportionality or even military necessity? Is there any basis for those claims that are being made by the NGOs, by the UN, by repeated in the media, by academics across the board, none of whom have any of that experience?
Well, I think it's important we define proportionality before we go into that detail for those people that don't have a handle on the precise meaning of the word under international humanitarian law. And so proportionality deals with any attack that's anticipated to have an indiscriminate result, or it's launching an attack with a weapon that's likely to have indiscriminate effects. So, for example, using poison gas or fire as a weapon. It also means that when you fire a weapon, you have to assess the collateral damage that's likely to be incurred, and you have to make the case that the target you're hitting is worth any damage that might be caused in addition to killing or destroying the target that you're firing at. And when it comes to this, I think the criticism we're largely seeing from Gaza is a reverse telescope. They're looking at it through the wrong end of the telescope. They're looking at the effects on the ground, and they're making an assessment about whether it was proportional or not based on how it looks, I think, is what it comes down to. And this is exploited, and I'm straying away from the legal stuff into the psychology stuff here, but it's designed to make people react that way. The reason you see so many pictures of dead children or so many pictures of ruined and rubblized neighborhoods is because it's trying to make you have an emotional reaction, because that kicks your amygdala into gear. It starts the stress hormones flowing, it starts adrenaline flowing, and it actually suppresses your prefrontal cortex, which is where your rational decision making is made. And so disinformation campaigns are designed to make you have that kind of emotional reaction. So you're making a decision and an assessment based on emotion, not rationality. And it's incredibly hard to argue someone with rationality out of a position they've taken from emotion, because there's no rationality underpinning their decision in the first place. And so going back to the legal part here, I think people are saying things are disproportionate because they look disproportionate. And actually there's no part of how an outcome looks of an airstrike as to whether something is proportionate or not. And so, the effects of an airstrike are being leveraged to hammer Israel with, when, frankly, anyone operating in an urban environment is going to see damage similar to what we see in Gaza today.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think the IDF, from everything I understand of it, the IDF takes great care with proportionality, which of course is a mandatory requirement if you're carrying out an attack that could potentially kill civilians. And they have pretty strong guidelines for what is and what is not proportionate. In other words, as Andrew really said, if you are going to attack a military target that in which civilians might possibly die, is the value of that target sufficient that it's worth risking the lives of civilians? And it's a fairly abstract concept, and in some cases, when, for example, the IDF is carrying out aerial operations, they're carrying out an air attack against a target based on intelligence or surveillance or whatever, then, particularly if there's a high risk of civilian casualties, then there will be legal sign-off to that. by a lawyer who will make a proportionality calculation, among other things, by an IDF lawyer. At the sort of level on the ground in particular, that doesn't really exist. It does on pre-planned operations. But in terms of infantry soldiers or tanks or whatever fighting on the ground, it's a calculation that has to be made sometimes immediately on the spot by the commander. And that can be a matter of minutes or seconds, or maybe a bit longer, depending on the circumstance. But I think the key thing is that when the IDF does this, you train soldiers to know what is meant by proportionality, so that they can very quickly make a decision. And the important thing is, I think that again is not often understood, is that as long as the soldier or the commander concerned believes that if he carries out an attack, there may be X number of civilian casualties. Because let's say in a building, there's, you might think, oh, there's some high value terrorist targets, I want to strike the targets. Possibly there's a couple of people in the building, they might be wounded or die as a consequence, but that, terrible as to say, may be worth it because it's important to kill that terrorist. But it turns out later that there were 10 civilians in the building. As long as the commander at the time believed what he believed, in other words, it would be a relatively low number of casualties, then he's not committing a war crime, he's not acting disproportionately. It's not the effect of what he does that's the key thing, it's the intent of what he does. And as long as a commander is willing and able to justify his actions in an investigation or even in court afterwards, then he as long as he's able to, from the basis of what he knew beforehand, then he's not committing a war crime. So I think it's far from exact science. I don't believe that there's anything in this war. This is one of the most complex wars I think that's ever been fought by any army in history. But I don't believe there's anything in this war that suggests that you shouldn't adhere to the laws of war as normal, including proportionality, as in any other war that anyone's ever fought. But I don't, a lot of people talk about we should change laws. I don't think we need to. We just need to recognize, and I think those people who are investigating or inquiries or launching lawsuits or whatever need to recognize at the same time that the enemy is doing everything it can to exploit the laws of war against you. That people say that Hamas ignore the laws of war. They don't ignore the laws of war. They exploit the laws of war to get the best advantage over you they can. I've had to make proportionality calculations in the past. I'm sure Andrew has as well. And it's as I said earlier, it's not an exact science, and mistakes are also sometimes made.
Can you talk a little bit about, I know Israel has lawyers advising at the command level, the division level. And I was wondering in the UK experience, how does that work? Because I think, isn't Israel unique in that they have lawyers at this level where they're really directly interacting with soldiers in the field, which you don't necessarily see with other armies, at seeking advice?
No, I think the British Army goes down to brigade, so we go one below.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's not unusual, but I think the difference is that MAG advice is legally binding on the IDF, whereas in the UK it's just advice, so it's not legally binding. Now it would be a very brave British commander who chinned off his legal advisor and went ahead with a strike anyway. If he's been told it's illegal, that would be unusual, I'd suggest. But the difference is with the IDF, it is absolutely legally binding, and they have to tailor their operations to the legal advice.
Yeah, I think one other thing to just add on that as well, and this applies both in the IDF and the British Army, and I'm sure the American Army as well, is that it's obviously totally impractical to have a lawyer running around beside a platoon commander or something like that, or a company commander. It's just ridiculous. And it probably will happen one day, but it hasn't happened yet. But I think So the legal advice is available, as Andrew said, down to division level in the IDF, down to brigade level in the British Army. And below that, the effectively legal advice is given in advance in the form of training. So soldiers, commanders at lower levels are trained to know what the laws of war are, and they're provided with rules of engagement, which effectively are documents that, or either documents or verbal briefings that essentially transmit the legal advice down to a given situation that you might find yourself in, and you're trained in that, you understand it. And there's obviously, there is, again, as I said before, there is the potential for mistakes to be made, for misinterpretations to occur in that whole process. But again, I repeat that a mistake, unless it's due to negligence, is certainly not a war crime.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you think I mean, and I think that's sort of what's so ridiculous about what we're seeing with these claims regarding Gaza, where you have the other side, which doesn't care at all about the laws of war, has no training, and it's totally discounted the level to which the IDF, has rules of engagement and training and ethical rules that are guiding what it does. And I guess also I'm interested in, when, experience with Afghanistan and Iraq, if also you saw similar dynamics as what's going on in Gaza, or how those experiences were similar and different in terms of the type of enemy you're fighting and how they're fighting, and how that maybe plays out on, on how you decide what operations to undertake.
I mean, I have a degree of a bugbear on the tendency that people have to map one campaign onto another. I think you can extract useful lessons from these similar campaigns, but Gaza is an urban war involving tunnels that go 50 feet underground and buildings that go 50 feet above ground, and a 360-degree battle space where it's incredibly hard to find the enemy before you even think about attacking them. Afghanistan was a counterinsurgency campaign, so we had towards the end. We had a zero appetite for any collateral damage whatsoever. They're just so different in terms of how the military operation played out on the ground, that I don't think there are hugely useful lessons tactically from Afghanistan in Gaza. I do think the fact that the IDF are not attempting a counterinsurgency campaign in Gaza is a good thing. I think trying to clear, hold, and build would be extremely challenging and would expose them to the same IED threat and kind of casualties that come with that we faced in Afghanistan. I think the one thing that potentially unites the two campaigns is the sort of jihadist enemy that we're fighting. They've got a similar sort of nihilistic mindset where they're quite happy to use suicide bombers and hide amongst civilians. And so I think that's probably where the lesson comes from, in terms of how you deal with an enemy that can be farming a field 1 minute, poking an AK at you the next minute, and then farming his field again 30 seconds later. That identification of the enemy, that positively identifying before you open fire, from a legal perspective, that's probably the key thing that decks across.
Yeah, I think one one of the things that differentiates, I think, the terrorists in Afghanistan and Iraq, and also Northern Ireland, which obviously is very different from jihadist terrorists, but have some similarities as well. But the one of the sort of fairly stark differentiation is that, as far as I'm aware, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and definitely in Northern Ireland, the terrorists did not want their own civilian population to be killed. Some may not have cared, may not have been too bothered about it, and there were plenty of civilians killed in all of those conflicts. But they used human shields in all of the conflicts, and you know, obviously knowing that civilians might die. But I think in this conflict, it's the first one that I'm aware of that a so-called army has, part of its strategy is for its own civilians to get killed, not just using them as human shields. And you know, the term human sacrifice is often used rather as a more accurate description of what they're trying to do, because of course have human shields, and that may deter your enemy, in this case the IDF, from striking you, and it may protect you. But equally, they're happy if the IDF do strike and kill a bunch of civilians, and sometimes try and lure them into killing civilians, very often try and lure them into killing civilians, so that can bring down vilification, isolation, I'm getting senile now, so I'm trying to think of the word I'm looking at, the delegitimization of Israel. And they, you know, this is a tactic. This is a tactic they deliberately have used repeatedly over all the conflicts to try and get as many civilians killed as possible to bring down pressure on Israel, and in particular in this particular war, to try and force the IDF to stop fighting as a result of international pressure, because that's the only way Hamas can survive if the IDF don't continue the war, and therefore it's very important to them. And of course, things like, you know, Human Rights Watch, UN Human Rights Council, the ICC, actions by the ICJ, things like freezing arms sales by the British government, all of these things play absolutely into their hands, because that's pressuring Israel is achieving exactly what they want by getting as many civilians killed as possible. And what that does, it's very dangerous, because it encourages them to do it again and again and again. And, you know, we've seen, you mentioned the Goalstone Report. The Goalstone Report, yep, by condemning Israel as it encouraged Hamas to use the same tactics and use them even more in subsequent conflicts. So the people that go about it in this way, in these different NGOs and international organizations, UN, different governments, actually have blood on their hands by playing the game that Hamas wants them to play, when they really shouldn't do so, and they don't need to.
You mentioned the Goalstone Report, which we come back to a lot because it was such a pivotal point. The same strategy was out there back at that time, and let's have the greatest number of civilian casualties, because that will put pressure on, we've called it, I think the academic term that's used is soft power warfare. So it's also connected to lawfare, and it's more than a tactic, it's a strategy. It goes hand in hand with the rocket attacks and the capture of hostages and everything else, and the human shields. One of the things that I had a conversation with Goalstone when after he issued his report, when they issued the report initially, and he read it out, the summary on CNN at the UN, and I was on the side panel of the CNN broadcast explaining or talking about the fact that he didn't know anything about what he was talking about because he had no military experience. He was reading somebody else, basically an NGO version of the events. That he realized at that point how little he knew, and how he'd been led, basically astray is a mild term, by the NGOs, by the UN people, by others that were part of this whole process. I'm going to reverse the question and ask it a different way. Are there people who do understand it, who you've encountered in the NGO world, in the legal world, in the academic world, that in the media, that do have a strong sense of all the things that you're talking about, the way in which international law, IHL, law of armed conflict, is manipulated, the way in which the civilian casualties and the emotional aspect plays into this process of determining on that basis what proportionality and disproportionality is. And all the people that you've encountered, I'm hoping you'll say there are people who get it, who understand it, or who have changed their views after seeing how wrong they were.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole department of academics at Sandhurst who are, far more capable a number of the army officers I know are analysing warfare and analysing these aspects of it. But I think really with anyone, the case is that you have to take a detailed interest in what's going on, and it's very, very hard to achieve the level of knowledge you need about a war unless you actually go there and see it yourself. And that's part of the problem here. And I noticed somebody raised in the questions the issue about journalists going into Gaza, and just to name drop, we were with the Prime Minister this afternoon, and he was asked the exact same question by a retired British general, and he didn't really have an answer actually, and that was quite interesting in and of itself. But I think potentially it's a lose-lose to let journalists in, because the first risk is that they're going to be biased anyway and just report how awful it is, and you get nothing out of that article. Or the second thing is they get killed by Hamas in 10 minutes. Their body gets paraded around the streets and shoved onto the internet in photo form, and Israel get blamed for it. And there's no good can come from that either. So, I'm pretty skeptical, and I'm pretty understanding of why Israel don't let journalists into Gaza. But in terms of the danger of analysing a conflict that you don't know intimately, it's very easy to go, I was a general, therefore I can analyse any war. It's like, well, no, what it means is when you go and learn about that war, your knowledge and your experience will be far better than someone that has never been to war. But, you need both parts of that puzzle. It's not enough to have been a soldier or have experience of warfare, or to be an academic who's read a lot of books about war. You then also need the actual practical knowledge of the war that you're talking about today. And it falls into that trap I mentioned earlier about just mapping one conflict onto another and assuming that everything's going to work the same way, because it simply doesn't.
Yeah, I've seen numerous interviews on things like Sky News, the BBC, etc., by retired generals, air marshals, whatever, talking about this war and also the Ukraine war as well. And I think virtually all of the ones I've seen, they've never been to Ukraine, they've never been over here, they don't know anything about it, yet they are retired air marshal so-and-so or retired general such and such. And so they think they can, they think they can give an intelligent opinion on this conflict. Now, to some extent, in general, they can, but they can't really be too authoritative, I don't think, and it can be misleading because they have credibility. They're a general, they're admiral, whatever, they've got some credibility, but it is also dangerous in exactly the way that Andrew described. I would, as far as journalists are concerned, I'll just relate one incident that occurred to me. I did an interview several years back on Sky News in the UK, and I finished the interview, walked down the corridor. The Middle East editor of Sky News approached me and said, "I need to speak to you," kind of prodding me with quite an aggressive look on his face. And I said, "What is it?" He said, "What you say about Israel." I thought, oh God, here we go. Let me have it then. And he said, "I agree with every word you say." And I said, "Well, if you agree with every word I say, why do you say the opposite?" He said, "Because if I didn't say it, I'd be fired." And that is, that shows that you've got an example there of a very, very capable journalist who is the victim of editorial policy. He knows the reality. The editors, I don't know whether they know or not, but they have a different agenda, and so he doesn't get to express his views. And I'm sure that probably applies to a lot of journalists from different news organizations. I think as far as lawyers are concerned, I've met several. The visit that Andrew and I are on now, we've got a couple of lawyers. I think the high-level military group, we had a lawyer with us as well. These are people who really do understand what's going on. So they are out there, but they're not going to be employed by the UN or by the ICC or by Human Rights Watch or any of these NGOs, because their opinions are incorrect. They're right, but they're incorrect. So that's the problem. Is I don't think the problem isn't so much one of understanding by individuals as what the overall agenda is in very many of these cases. And another comment to make on that briefly is the arms embargo by the UK. Now, I think everyone can be pretty clear, I certainly am from what I've read about it, this is not based on the law, it's not based on anything except political pressure from within the Labour Party by anti-Israel, pro-Hamas members of that party who are probably in the majority, or certainly a very significant number of them. Yet, and the civil servants who, the civil servants who are responsible for researching and signing these things off, some of them may well have an understanding of it, and some of them may well want to apply the law properly. They may well do. But on the other hand, you also, I read in the media that a number of civil servants in the department that's responsible for signing off weapons deals or authorization threatened to go on strike if the government didn't suspend weapons delivery to the IDF. So, and these are, they can't be doing it on the basis of facts or the law. They must be doing it on the basis of their own ideology, which is, I think, a very dangerous thing.
One thing that we see a lot in certainly the NGO reporting, but it's also, especially in this conflict, coming out in the media, is talking about, let's say, the 2,000-pound bombs or the use of white phosphorus. And so they a lot of the NGOs simplify the issues relating to the types of munitions used, or employ a very superficial analysis. They'll say something, and actually this is how we originally started speaking, Richard. I remember way back when on white phosphorus, because I was asking, HRW was making claims that ground burst white phosphorus was safer than air burst. And I remember you saying, well, if you're using ground burst, it could actually be more lethal because the way the shell ejects, it could end up killing more people than if you sometimes use it air burst, and you have to consider different factors depending on how munitions used. And Human Rights Watch would talk about that there were alternatives, red phosphorus, but maybe Israel didn't even have that in their arsenal, or maybe it doesn't, have the same capabilities as white phosphorus. So I'm wondering if you both could talk about how when you're undertaking a military operation, how do you make choices regarding what munition to use, and also what do you think the NGOs and the media get wrong? What do they get wrong about this topic when it's just, they're sort of trying to vilify the use of a specific weapon?
I mean, that's a tricky one. That's a tricky one because there's such a broad span when you say they're using white phosphorus. Okay, to do what? Is it obscuration? Are they firing it at civilians deliberately? I mean, there's no, just saying the words white phosphorus seem to be enough for some people to condemn immediately, because it's a stigmatized kind of weapon, as it were. I mean, it's not even a weapon; it's a tool, but it's stigmatized just from the words white phosphorus. And you have to understand exactly what was happening on the ground at that moment in time to justify the use of white phosphorus. You then have to understand what happens in terms of the actual firing of the round itself. Was due care taken to make sure that it was away potentially from civilian areas? There's so many factors that play into this, and people tend to condemn it just from the use of white phosphorus. Again, we're back to emotion. We're back to effects-based criticism rather than legal-based criticism. And 2,000 pounders, we had David Debtula, he's a retired US Air Force general, out with us on the high-level military group, and he's a signatory to our reports. And he made the really excellent point that a 2,000-pound bomb may be a dumb bomb, but it's not dumb if it's fired by a smart pilot from a smart aircraft. And the combination of those two things, in terms of the computing assistance that's given to that dumb bomb to make sure it hits the target, it can be accurate to within 30 meters. And there's a whole targeting process of selection of munition before they will select, finally land upon a 2,000-pound bomb. So if they're using one, it's because they need to for the target that's being selected. And obviously a 2,000-pound bomb comes with a big blast and high potential for collateral damage. And that's where the assessment paperwork needs to come in before they authorize the strike. But once again, if you've not seen that paperwork or that process or the thought process of the pilot when he was selecting a target and pulling the trigger, then you haven't got enough information to draw any conclusions whatsoever. Now, we could be talking about airstrikes that actually are illegal. It's entirely possible that they've chinned off their targeting process and they've dropped illegal bombs. I mean, I don't know. You don't know. But until that is actually investigated properly and you know, they can show you the forms they fill out. I've got a copy of a top secret one that's been redacted so I can use it. But it's absolutely what we would do for any airstrike in the British in the British military. So, you know, all of the kind of anecdotal surrounding stuff that I've seen is entirely reassuring when they've briefed me on their processes and they've briefed me on the legal considerations they make before a strike. But it's only anecdotal and it's only kind of building a big picture. But for any given strike in Gaza, I couldn't tell you if it was legal or not because I just don't have the information. And by the same token, nobody can conclusively say that it's illegal unless they've got that information too.
Yeah, I think on the white phosphorus front, the press generally, and including some of these so-called human rights organizations and the UN, they kind of got it into their head that white phosphorus is a chemical weapon.
Right.
Which is not. Okay, it may be made up of chemicals, but so are any munitions. But it's not a chemical weapon by definition. And they've got the idea that it can't be used and it shouldn't be used, and it's only really the evil IDF that use it. Well, the reality is the British and the Americans both use white phosphorus in Afghanistan and Iraq, and white phosphorus can be used, except it can only not be used if it's fired deliberately fired into a civilian area. Otherwise, it can be used. But if you listen to what the people in the media say, that's very often that is just simply forbidden to use it. And there's so many of these different distortions to do with different weapon systems or whatever. And I think, just another example, the IDF, I don't know if they still are, but at one point in Judea and Samaria, they were using some tainted water called skunk, I think. Is it skunk?
Skunk
Yeah,
water.
Water that smells very, very bad. And they were using that for dispersal purposes. And that was, again, I saw several times that was described as they're using chemical weapons, which wasn't a chemical weapon. So, and once the distortion is there, it sticks. But I would also agree with Andrew that, the IDF, from everything I've seen, are very careful about selecting a particular munition to do a particular job. And if you want to fire a munition into the third floor of an apartment building, into the certain window, and they select the appropriate munition. They don't drop a multi-thousand-pound bomb on it. If they want to destroy a tunnel, they're not going to use that little munition. So they're very, I think, very careful, and there are rules about what they can and can't do.
I want to ask, go ahead, Ann.
And I was just going to say, could you also just talk a little bit about how the tunnels complicate the operations in Gaza?
Yeah, for sure. It's really important that we understand what the tunnels actually are and what they're there for. Okay, they're not fighting tunnels in the conventional sense. So when the IDF are going into them, you're not seeing like World War I trenches where you've got kinks, to stop someone firing all the way from one end to the other. In some of the tunnels in Gaza, you could absolutely do that. They are a maneuver capability. Okay, I think we have to see the tunnels as a strategic weapon. They're a weapon system. They're not just these underground tunnels. They're designed specifically to negate the IDF's strengths. The IDF have an overwhelming overmatch over Hamas in terms of air power, in terms of reconnaissance and the use of drones, and in the use of ground maneuver. So what Hamas have done is try to take those things away from the IDF and make themselves much, much harder to target by being underground. So they use the tunnels to scoot around Gaza. They pop up at very close range, 50 to 70 meters. They have a super short engagement, then they're back down into the tunnels and they're away again. Added to which they can live underground. The IDF have found vitamins or vitamins, for those of you who are American, vitamin D, because they're not getting sunlight because they're underground for months at a time. So they're really prepared to live in these tunnels. Some of the accommodation areas have astroturf and the bathrooms are tiled with built-in sewerage systems. It's an incredible underground living space, but it's designed for maneuver and to avoid the IDF strengths. So once we frame it in that way, I think we see that what the IDF have had to do is completely change the way they fight in the urban environment. And what we're seeing is what we call simultaneous combined arms ground maneuver. And it's really impressive because that's an incredibly hard thing to do when you've got troops moving along the tunnels, when you've got airstrikes coming in on various tunnel shafts to seal them off, when you've got drones hovering over tunnel shafts to clock people leaving so you can get more intelligence. And then you've got also troops maneuvering on the ground, and you have to coordinate all of that stuff so it works in harmony, whilst integrating special forces, integrating air power. It's quite an astonishing operational achievement, and the IDF have hugely improved at it since they started going down into the tunnels, to the point now where I think it was the Khan Yunis division commander said that his troops could move faster now underground than they could on the surface in Gaza. That's how well the IDF have adapted to this. But it's a whole new challenge. I don't think anyone has ever had to fight a strategic weapon system of the nature of these tunnels. And of course, that means it has to be a learning experience, because they're transforming in contact. They're learning whilst someone's shooting at them. So it's a very impressive achievement from where I'm sat.
Yeah, nothing much to add really, except to say that the tunnel system is an extremely hazardous system for soldiers who are trying to clear them. And just to mention a couple of things that cause real problems is that very often in tunnels they have built-in booby traps built into the wall or fixed to the wall in a place that can't be seen, which is basically explosive devices to kill soldiers coming down, and those booby trap devices are covered by cameras, so they can be initiated from outside the tunnel, inside the tunnel, somewhere, some distance away, as soon as the soldier approaches. So that's an extreme hazard. The same applies in every building, not necessarily every building, but in many buildings as well. The booby trap device, sometimes very large ones, covered by a camera so that they can be detonated at exactly the right time. And that helps account for why it's been necessary to destroy so many houses inside Gaza, because of that you either send a soldier in to see if it's booby trapped and get blown up, or you blow the house up first. And obviously the IDF don't want to have any more of their soldiers killed than they have to. So, but there are also some of the tunnels, they have very heavy blast doors, which you have to smash down in order to get the bomb through the tunnel. So more and more complications, and they've developed, I think, some extremely innovative and effective systems for fighting in these tunnels, which I think I don't know if another army is going to encounter the same problem in the future, quite possibly, because they've been pretty effective. But I'm sure many armies will be learning a lot of lessons from the way the IDF have developed their tactics for operating in these tunnels.
I want to ask one last question, which is, I guess, in a certain sense, not necessarily one that can be answered, but it seems to me, I'll do it as a hypothesis, that international law, post-World War II international law, the way it's developed, IHL, law of armed conflict, basically eliminates the potential for deterrence. Deterrence, as we knew it, was certainly developed. I did this in my graduate school years, nuclear deterrence, which involves killing a large number of people. It involves punishment so that the decision makers know that if they initiate a conflict, they will then suffer the consequences. They'll be overwhelming. It seems to me that international law prevents that, which means if you prevent deterrence, you're going to have a lot more warfare. You're going to encourage a lot more groups like Hamas to develop the capabilities to suck in an army like Israel and then get attacked, demonized, delegitimized for violations of international law. I'm wondering whether you agree with that perspective on the problem of deterrence within the philosophical framework of modern international law, IHL.
We have to look at the Caroline case, I think, if we're talking about deterrence, because if you're going to indulge in preemptive self-defense, then it has to be immediate. It has to be, there's no other option, and it has to be, there's another factor I forget, but it's the Caroline case that gives us the basis for preemptive self-defense. And I don't think huge amounts have changed there. I mean, the point about international law, I think, is that it only works if people sign up to it and actually adhere to it. And we've certainly seen legal grey spaces around some of the assassinations that have taken place. And if we think about Soleimani and strikes like that, you could potentially make a case to say that yes, they were illegal. And that was the Americans dropping bombs, and they've had a policy of that under Obama of these preemptive assassinations that are certainly in a legal grey area as far as international law and deterrence is concerned. So, I think when it comes to deterrence, you are in that slightly grey space where, you have to say, look, I am going to hit you, and it's because I think you're going to hit me. But, I think you're probably outside the bounds there slightly. But who's going to do anything about it if you're the United States? No one.
If Israel would have attacked some of the underground tunnels 2 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever number of years, and we tried back in a little bit of that in 2008, 9, 2014, 2021, there were a number of very limited rounds of that, but they always stopped short of a preemption, which is also related to deterrence in some ways. So
yeah, that was international pressure. I think that's the really important point here. Is it that set the precedent for what we're seeing in Gaza today? They've had, I counted it the other day, there was like 8 separate occasions since 2002 where Israel has responded. And I don't think it's deterrence, or I don't think it's a preemptive strike. I think they've just responded to being attacked or responded to events. And international pressure has forced them to stop. And it's given that model now where they demonize and demonize and demonize. They allege breach after breach after breach of law. And it doesn't matter if it's grey area or not, because the odds are it probably is legal. But if you say it enough, that international pressure makes Israel stop, and they have done. And I think the one thing I would credit Netanyahu for over the duration of this war is his ability to have resisted that pressure, when in the past, I think Israel has failed to resist the pressure. So I think there's credit where credit's due there, frankly.
Yeah, I don't think international law negates deterrence. I think abuse of international law does. And our readiness to allow people like Hamas and other terrorist organizations to exploit international law against us, I think that is the problem. But I would say, in terms of what has undermined deterrence, I think it's the kind of fanaticism that you get from Hamas. I mean, by traditional definition, it applies to Hezbollah as well. In some ways, by kind of definition, what deterrent can Israel impose on Hamas? Okay, we've got a very capable, very sophisticated army that outguns you and will defeat you, and probably kill a lot of your people and smash up a lot of your buildings if you attack us. But it didn't deter. That didn't deter because they're fanatics. Nothing would deter them at all from doing what they did. And so that you've got to wonder if there is any concept of deterrence when you're dealing with people like that. And I would apply the same thing to Iran. You've got, Israel's allegedly a nuclear armed state, and Iran is not deterred by that nuclear armed state. It's not deterred either from attacking Israel, and it's not deterred from developing its own nuclear weapons. Why? Because I've seen, I'm sure Gerald, you have as well, I've seen many statements coming out of Iran and articles, etc., coming out of Iran, which give you every reason to believe that Iran is, that they're okay. If let's say they fire a nuclear weapon, if they get it at Israel, and that would be absolutely devastating for Israel, even knowing that there was going to be a retaliatory attack from Israel, that should deter them from firing in the first place. But it doesn't. It won't, because they don't care. They believe, because it's a religious duty to what they're doing, they're willing to sacrifice thousands, maybe even millions of their own people in order to do their religious duty. So how do you deter a fanatic like that? How do you deter a suicide bomber who's willing to die for his cause? What's going to deter him? So I think the nature of deterrence needs to be looked at more closely, not so much in the context of the way international law might or might not deter, but how that kind of religious fanaticism deter, how that works in relation to deterrence.
Sounds like another topic for a webinar, a long one. Anne, I think we're reaching the end of our time frame.
Yeah, I think we can close it out. I think we could have this discussion for many more hours. I think it's a really important discussion that just doesn't get had enough, just in the media, by NGOs, by the UN, and the way they're kind of truncating this discussion or trying to erase this discussion in order to advance their political agenda, something that we need to come up with continuing ways to counter and make sure that we can insert this discussion onto the agenda. So I just want to thank both of you for taking the time to speak with us, and hope we can have further discussions in the future.
Thank you very much. And I would like to add one other thing. I've been, you said 15 years, it's something like that. I've been working in various different ways, working with NGO Monitor, and I think you do an absolutely fantastic job. The work you do is absolutely invaluable, and keep going, keep at it, and is making a real difference.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Thanks all for joining us. Thanks for everything that you're doing. We'll close it off here. Bye-bye.